Before we descend into the unsettling quiet of tonight's tale, a gentle reminder. If you find yourself returning to these restless stories, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more uneasy slumbers. Now, let us step into the first chapter of Yu-Gi-Oh! To sleep peacefully in a haunted monastery. Spoiler, you don't. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Restless Slumber. The monastery stood atop the cliffs of Blackvale like a crooked tooth, in an otherwise unremarkable jawline of rock. Its walls, once the color of freshly baked bread, had darkened over centuries into something resembling the crust of a loaf forgotten at the bottom of an oven. The locals called it the Whispering Abbey. Not because the wind carried secrets through its broken windows, though it did, but because the stones themselves seemed to murmur. If you pressed your ear to them at dusk, you might catch a word or two. Most of them were in Latin. None of them were comforting. Why would anyone choose to sleep here? The answer, like most answers involving terrible decisions, was a mix of pride, desperation, and a distinct lack of better options. The monastery had been built in 1137 by a group of monks who believed suffering was the quickest path to enlightenment. They were right, though not in the way they hoped. Within a year of its completion, half of them had thrown themselves from the bell tower. The others simply vanished, leaving behind only their robes neatly folded at the edges of their cots, as if they had stepped out for a midnight stroll and forgotten to return. Centuries passed. The monastery changed hands more times than a counterfeit coin. Each new owner, whether a reclusive order of nuns, a bankrupt nobleman, or an overconfident historian, claimed they could tame its unrest. None succeeded. The last resident, a self-proclaimed spiritual architect named Alistair Voss, had attempted to convert it into a luxury retreat for those seeking transformative encounters with the unseen. The brochure, which still littered the village inn's pamphlet rack, promised serenity amidst the echoes of the past. It failed to mention that the echoes in question were primarily screams. And yet, here you are. Perhaps you've come because you don't believe in ghosts, or because you do and think you can outwit them. Maybe you're here on a dare, or because every other inn within 20 miles was fully booked, or because some part of you, the part that still remembers childhood fears, wants to prove you can face the dark without flinching. Whatever the reason, you've paid your silver to the grizzled caretaker, who refused to step foot inside after sunset, and now stand in the courtyard, staring up at the abbey's gaping doorway. The air smells of damp stone and something faintly metallic like old blood or rusted hinges. The caretaker had handed you a single candle, its wax already weeping in the chill. "Light it when you get inside," he'd grunted. "The shadows here don't like fire." You'd laughed, assuming it was a joke. His expression suggested otherwise. Inside, the monastery is colder than the night outside. The candle's flame wavers as if uncertain its welcome. The walls are lined with peeling frescoes of saints, their eyes scratched out by time or something less patient. The floor creaks with every step, not in the way old wood normally does, but in the way of something shifting beneath it. Your assigned cell is at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar, as though someone left in a hurry. The bed is narrow, the blanket thin, and the pillow smells faintly of mildew and incense. You tell yourself it's fine. You've slept in worse places. This is a lie. But lies are comforting in the dark. You blow out the candle. The darkness swallows the room whole. Then the whispering starts. At first it's easy to dismiss as the wind. But the wind doesn't usually form words, and it certainly doesn't laugh. The voice, if it is a voice, is coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows are thickest. It's speaking in a language you don't recognize, though the tone is unmistakably amused. You fumble for the candle, hands shaking. The flame sputters back to life and the whispers stop. The corner is empty. You lie back down. The candle stays lit. Outside, the wind howls through the cliffs, and the stones of the monastery grumble amongst themselves. Somewhere far below, the sea crashes against the rocks, a sound like bones breaking. You close your eyes. Sleep, when it comes, is thin and fitful, and in your dreams you hear the monks singing. It isn't a hymn. Morning, should it ever arrive, will not bring relief. But that is a worry for another chapter. For now, there is only the dark, the whispers, and the growing certainty that you are not alone in this room. Chapter 2. The Architect's Folly. Brother Aldrich of Blackvale was not a man who believed in straight lines. This, more than anything else, explained why the monastery looked as though it had been assembled by a drunkard with a grudge against symmetry. His design philosophy, if it could be called that, was best summed up by his personal motto: "Gay God loves chaos, for he made the world uneven." This was not, strictly speaking, theologically sound, but then again, neither was Brother Aldrich. Before taking holy orders, he had been a stonemason with a reputation for buildings that leaned, doorways that slanted, and staircases that led to nowhere in particular. His patrons often complained. He often ignored them. When the Abbot of Blackvale commissioned him to design a monastery worthy of divine contemplation, Aldrich interpreted this as permission to indulge every architectural whim he'd ever suppressed. The result was a building that seemed to defy gravity, logic, and occasionally the laws of physics. The arches were his particular obsession. No two were alike. Some swooped like a falcon in mid-dive, others twisted like a hanged man's final contortion. One, above the refectory, resembled a serpent swallowing its own tail, a detail the abbot only noticed after the mortar had dried. When questioned, Aldrich insisted it was symbolic of eternity. The abbot, who had been hoping for something more along the lines of a simple semicircle, sighed and made the sign of the cross. Aldrich's greatest pride was the bell tower. It spiraled upward in a series of irregular tiers, each slightly off-center from the last, giving the impression that the entire structure was on the verge of toppling over. The bell itself was hung at an angle, which meant its tolling had a lopsided, drunken cadence. Visitors often remarked that it sounded less like a call to prayer and more like a death knell for a particularly indecisive sinner. Then came the night of the great collapse. It happened during a storm so violent that even the stoic villagers of Blackvale huddled in their cellars, convinced the world was ending. The wind howled through Aldrich's crooked arches, with a noise like a chorus of damned souls. The bell tower, already straining under its own absurdity, finally gave way. Stones rained down onto the cloister, crushing the herb garden and 3 unlucky novices who had been attempting to harvest time in the middle of a tempest. Their last words, according to the sole survivor, were, "Why are we outside right now?" Aldrich, who had been inside sketching a new design for a chapel shaped like a broken wheel, was found the next morning. He was seated at his desk, quill still in hand, a look of serene satisfaction on his face. The cause of death was unclear. Some said a falling beam. Others whispered of a stroke brought on by artistic ecstasy. The only certainty was that he had died mid-duddle, leaving behind a half-finished sketch of a doorway that bent backward into itself. His ghost, as it turned out, was even more fastidious than the man had been in life. The first sign of his posthumous activity came when the new abbot, a sensible man who preferred right angles, attempted to correct some of the monastery's more egregious structural flaws. The morning after the carpenters straightened a warped door frame, they returned to find it twisted into a perfect spiral. The masons who repaired a leaning wall awoke to discover it now curved like a question mark. When the abbot ordered Aldrich's crooked bell replaced with a properly hung one, the replacement was found the next day in the courtyard, bent into the shape of a pretzel. By the time you arrive centuries later, Aldrich's ghost has settled into a routine. He no longer bothers with grand gestures like collapsing towers. Instead, he contents himself with minor adjustments. Chairs are never where you left them. Doors open inward when they should open outward. The floorboards creak in patterns that suggest footsteps, but only when you're not looking. Tonight, as you lie in your narrow cell, you hear it. The scrape of wood on stone, the faint creak of something being dragged across the floor. You sit up, clutching your candle, and watch as the room's sole chair slides, unaided, from one corner to another. It stops at an angle that shouldn't be possible without toppling over. It doesn't topple. A draft slithers through the room, carrying the scent of old parchment and wet mortar. Somewhere in the darkness a satisfied sigh echoes, the sound of an artist stepping back to admire his work. You consider protesting. You could point out that the chair was perfectly functional where it was. You could argue that no reasonable person would want a seat positioned directly beneath a perpetually dripping patch of ceiling. But you know, deep down, that it wouldn't matter. Brother Aldrich never cared for practicality in life. Death has not improved him. You blow out the candle. The chair, you notice in the last flicker of light, has moved again. It now faces the bed. Sleep, if you can manage it, will be a temporary reprieve. When you wake, the room will have shifted in subtle ways. The window will be slightly higher. The door will be a shade narrower. And the ceiling, you realize with a slow sinking dread, now has the faintest suggestion of a spiral. Somewhere in the dark a ghost is still sketching. Chapter 3. The Choir of the Damned. Midnight in the monastery was not a time of silence. It was a time of off-key lamentations, of holy words mangled by centuries of poor vocal technique, and of a single stubbornly flat soprano that cut through the darkness like a spoon scraping burnt porridge from a pot. This was the hour of the Choir of the Damned, and they took their singing very, very seriously. The choir had not always been damned. Once, long before the monastery stones had settled into their current state of perpetual unease, they had been ordinary monks, devout, disciplined, and, unfortunately, entirely tone-deaf. Their abbot, a man named Father Ignatius, had been a former musician with an ear so finely tuned that the sound of a single misaligned note could send him into fits of spiritual despair. When he discovered that his entire flock sang as though their vocal cords had been strangled at birth, he saw it not as a challenge, but as a divine test. He would teach them to sing properly, even if it killed them. And it did. Father Ignatius' methods were unorthodox, even by medieval standards. He believed that the key to musical purity lay in suffering. Monks who faltered in pitch were made to stand barefoot on frozen flagstones until their toes turned blue. Those who struggled with rhythm were forced to balance on one leg while reciting psalms backward. The worst offenders, those who could not distinguish between a major and minor key if their souls depended on it, were subjected to his infamous harmonic isolation, which involved being locked in a windowless closet with nothing but a single, endlessly droning pipe organ note for company. Unsurprisingly, the choir did not improve. If anything, they got worse. Their voices, strained by punishment and terror, took on the quality of rusted hinges. Their chanting, which should have been a balm to the soul, instead sounded like a chorus of dying goats. Father Ignatius, driven to the edge of madness, finally declared that if they could not sing for God in this life, they would sing for him in the next. The details of what happened next were lost to time, but the results were undeniable. One morning, the monastery awoke to find the choir dead in their pews, their mouths still open in mid-chant, their hymnals clutched in stiff fingers. Father Ignatius was found at the lectern, his baton raised, as though frozen, mid-conducting. The official record claimed it was a sudden fever. The unofficial consensus was that the choir had collectively willed themselves into the afterlife just to escape rehearsal. Their ghostly return was not immediate. It took 3 nights for the first faint strains of their singing to echo through the halls. A halting, hesitant rendition of Dies Irae that wavered between keys like a drunkard stumbling down a flight of stairs. Over the centuries, their nightly performances became a fixture of monastery life, much to the dismay of everyone who ever tried to sleep there. The problem, as you quickly discover, is not merely that they are bad. It is that they are, yea, committedly bad. The choir does not simply repeat their mortal mistakes. They amplify them. The same monk who once struggled with high C now warbles a full octave above it, his voice cracking like ice over a thawing river. The brother who could never quite keep tempo now drags so far behind the others that his syllables linger like unwelcome guests long after the rest have moved on. And then there is Brother Anselm, the aforementioned soprano, whose voice is so consistently aggressively flat that it has been known to make candles flicker in sympathy. You first hear them as the last stroke of midnight fades. The sound begins as a whisper, a rustle of spectral robes and the creak of ancient pews. Then, as one, they inhale, a sound like wind through a graveyard, and begin. The chant they choose tonight is Eerie Exalve Regina, though it takes you several minutes to recognize it. The melody, already mournful in its original form, has been stretched and twisted into something that resembles a dirge for a cat who died under ambiguous circumstances. Brother Anselm, as always, is the loudest. His voice pierces through the others like a nail through a boot, each note landing just shy of where it ought to be. You briefly consider stuffing your ears with wax, but something stops you. It is the look on their faces. Through the half-open door of your cell you catch glimpses of them, pale, translucent figures arranged in the chapel's ruined choir stalls, their eyes fixed on a point just above the altar where Father Ignatius' ghost stands, forever poised to begin conducting. His expression is one of eternal, exasperated despair. Theirs, however, is something else. They are not singing well. They will never sing well. But they are singing together with a fervor that borders on defiance. Every missed note, every mangled phrase, is a rebellion against the man who tried to perfect them. They are terrible, and they are proud. By the time they reach the final verse, you find yourself strangely moved. There is something almost beautiful in their stubborn imperfection, in the way they cling to their flaws as though they were virtues. When the last note fades, a discordant wail that lingers like a bad smell, you half expect applause. Instead, there is only silence, broken by Father Ignatius's faint, despairing sigh. Then the chairs in the chapel rearrange themselves with a violent screech, Brother Aldrich's handiwork asserting itself even here. The choir shuffles, adjusts, and without preamble begins again. This time, it's Ave Mariae. You close the door. Some battles are not worth fighting. Sleep, if it comes at all, will be accompanied by the distant, dogged determination of the worst choir in Christendom. And as you drift off, you realize something unsettling. You are starting to recognize the melodies beneath the mess. This is how they get you. Chapter 4. The Haunted Chamber Pot. Of all the indignities one might suffer in a haunted monastery, being serenaded by tone-dead spirits, having one's furniture rearranged by a long-dead architect with no respect for right angles, none is quite so profoundly mortifying as being lectured on personal hygiene by the ghost of a medieval monk while attempting to use the latrine. Brother Hubert had been in life the monastery's self-appointed arbiter of cleanliness. This was a problematic vocation in an era when bathing was considered a suspiciously secular activity, and the concept of germs would not be discovered for another 6th century. Undeterred by the limitations of his time, Hubert had dedicated his mortal years to a tireless crusade against what he termed moral filth, which included everything from unwashed hands to improperly folded bed linens. His fellow monks tolerated his zeal with the strained patience of men who knew they would outlive him. They were wrong. Hubert's downfall came not from plague or battle, but from his own fastidiousness. Convinced that the monastery's privies were a breeding ground for spiritual decay, and though he didn't know the word bacteria, he had taken to scrubbing them with a mixture of vinegar, crushed rosemary, and righteous fury. It was during one such cleaning frenzy that he slipped on a patch of soap of his own making, struck his head on the edge of a stone sink, and died with a look of profound offense etched onto his face. Death did not mellow him. Hubert's ghost lingered in the latrines, his translucent form hovering near the ceiling like an anxious bat, his voice a reedy whisper that carried the weight of centuries of disapproval. His spectral presence was marked by a faint scent of rosemary and an overwhelming aura of judgment. Visitors to the monastery often mistook him for a particularly aggressive draught, until he spoke. You encounter him for the first time shortly after midnight, when the combination of weak ale and a questionable stew from the village inn forces you to seek out the monastery's less glamorous accommodations. The latrine is a small dank chamber at the end of a narrow corridor, its wooden seat worn smooth by generations of uneasy occupants. You have barely settled in when a sigh like the wind through a graveyard rattles the walls. That is, naughty, the proper posture for efficient evacuation. Hubert intones, his voice emanating from somewhere near the ceiling. You freeze. There are few things more unsettling than being critiqued by an invisible presence while in a vulnerable position. You consider arguing, but before you can form a coherent response, Hubert continues. Back straight, elbows on knees. Honestly, I would have thought even a layman would know that much. A faint shimmer in the air resolves into the gaunt, disapproving face of a monk who has not smiled in at least 500 years. His ghostly robes are cinched tightly around his waist, as though even in death he fears the indignity of an untucked tunic. You mutter something about privacy. Hubert sniffs. Privacy is a luxury afforded to those who demonstrate basic competence. You, my friend, are teetering on the edge of disgrace. He drifts closer, peering down with an expression of academic interest. And your diet is clearly deficient in fiber. I can tell just by the... You cut him off with a strangled noise of protest. Hubert rears back, looking wounded. There's no need to be uncivilized. I'm only trying to help. He folds his translucent arms. Brother Aldrich may content himself with rearranging furniture, and the choir may wallow in their harmonic ineptitude, but ye have standards. Over the next few minutes, you are treated to a lecture on medieval digestive health, so thorough it borders on traumatic. Hubert expounds on the virtues of bran, the dangers of excessive mead consumption, and the proper use of a strigil, a tool you had hoped never to hear described in detail. His voice takes on a wistful tone as he recalls the monastery's golden age, when the latrines were scrubbed daily and the brothers observed a strict schedule of regulated purgation. No look at this place, he laments, gesturing to a patch of moss you had been trying very hard not to notice. Disgraceful, utterly disgraceful. You make the mistake of pointing out that the monastery is, technically, a ruin. Hubert's ghostly visage darkens. No truant house of God is beyond redemption, he snaps. Why, if I had just a fraction of my old supplies, a bit of lye, some fresh straw, a willing novice or two. His voice trails off into a sigh. Then, with the air of a man resigned to eternal disappointment, he vanishes, leaving behind only the faintest whiff of rosemary. You finish your business in haste. Later, as you attempt to wash your hands in a basin of suspiciously murky water, Hubert reappears with a sound like a deflating bellows. You're not even scrubbing, he says, horrified. You stare at him. He stares at your hands. A long, silent battle of wills ensues. Eventually, with a noise of profound disgust, he seizes a bar of lye soap that definitely wasn't there a moment ago and thrusts it toward you. 20 seconds, he commands. Or so help me. I will haunt you, ye personally. You wash your hands. Thoroughly. Hubert watches like a hawk eyeing a particularly dim-witted mouse. When you're done, he gives a grudging nod. Adequate, he mutters. Then, with a final glare at the damp patch on the floor where you may or may not have missed the basin slightly, he dissipates like smoke. You return to your cell, your dignity in tatters. Behind you, the sound of furious scrubbing follows you down the hall. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful. You dream of soap, Dawn is still hours away, but somewhere in the darkness, a very determined ghost is still fighting his eternal war against filth. And as you drift off, you can't help but wonder, if Hubert ever really get his hands on a willing novice, what terrible fate would await them? Some questions are better left unanswered. Chapter 5. The candle that won't stay lit and the shadows that do. The caretaker had warned you about the monastery's shadows. They don't behave, he'd grunted, pressing a stub of candle into your palm. His fingernails were black with old wax, as though he'd spent years wrestling with stubborn wicks. Light this when it gets dark, and don't let it go out. You'd assumed it was superstition. Now, as the flame sputters for the third time in as many minutes, you're reconsidering. The draft that snuffs it isn't coming from any window or crack in the stone. It comes from the shadows themselves, a slow, deliberate exhale, as if the darkness is sighing in your ear. The monastery's shadows have opinions. They don't lurk where they're supposed to. The corner by the broken lectern, for example, remains stubbornly well lit no matter how many candles you place there, while the perfectly ordinary patch of floor beneath your bed drinks light like a sponge. Shadows pool where they please, creeping along the walls with the unhurried confidence of cats that know they own the house. And then there are the whispers. At first, they're easy to dismiss as wind or the distant, off-key murmurs of the choir of the damned practicing scales. But wind doesn't mutter about turnips. The voice, if it can be called that, is a dry, papery thing, rustling just beneath the threshold of hearing. It lists items in no particular order. Parsley, a new quill, beeswax, rosemary. No, wait, we already have rosemary. You freeze. The caretaker hadn't mentioned grocery lists. The candle flickers again. You cup a hand around it, but the flame shrinks anyway, cowering like a beaten dog. Across the room, a shadow detaches itself from the wall and slinks toward the foot of your bed. It has no discernible shape, just a deeper blackness where blackness already reigns. But you feel it watching you. Mutten, it adds thoughtfully. You consider blowing out the candle yourself, if only to spare it the indignity of being extinguished by something that sounds like a disorganized housewife. But before you can, the flame gives one last, valiant sputter, and dies. Darkness swallows the room. For a moment, there's only silence. Then, the whispering starts in earnest. Timmy, announces a shadow by the door. Your team's already on the list, retorts another from the ceiling. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. You just didn't hear because you were too busy listing mutton twice. A third shadow, this one near the window, clears its throat, a sound like dead leaves skittering across stone. Via out of tallow. A pause. Then, in unison, all the shadows sigh. You lie very still. This is not how you imagined your death, suffocated by sentient darkness arguing over pantry staples. The absurdity of it almost outweighs the terror. Almost. Then one of them notices you. Oh, says the shadow by the bed. You're still here. You consider pretending to be asleep. It's too late. You know if the village still sells saffron on market days? Asks the ceiling shadow. You blink. What? Saffron, it repeats, as though speaking to a particularly slow child. Expensive, yellow, makes food taste better. I don't know, you manage. The shadows confer in hushed tones. Goses nes, mutas one. Absolutely useless. You take offense to this. You're not the one haunting a monastery like a disgruntled housekeeper. The argument resumes. Can't keep putting off the tallow. The candles won't light themselves. They won't light on period pumbus, grumbles the bed shadow. You seize the opportunity. Is that why the candle keeps going out? Because you need tallow? The shadows go very still. Then, slowly, the one by the window oozes closer. It smells faintly of old parchment and regret. We don't need anything, it says, bristling. We are shadows. But someone has to keep this place running, and clearly, someone forgot to restock the... A loud infumphum from the hallway cuts it off. The shadows freeze. Even the whispering stops. Then, from the corridor, comes the unmistakable sound of furniture being dragged across stone. Brother Aldrich is redecorating again. The shadows disperse with a sound like ink swirling down a drain. By the time you fumble the candle alight again, the room is empty, or at least it appears to be. The flame burns steady, untroubled. You don't trust it. Sleep is a long time coming. When it does, your dreams are full of endless lists, written in a hand you can't quite read. You wake once to the sound of something scratching near the door, quill on parchment perhaps, or claws. In the morning, you find a scrap of vellum on the floor. The writing is faded but legible. Tallow, saffron, if affordable. Stop forgetting the time. You pocket it, just in case. Dawn's light does nothing to dispel the monastery's stubborn darkness. The corners remain defiantly shadowed, the air thick with the promise of more whispers to come. You wonder if the village sells tallow. Then you wonder why you're wondering. Somewhere, a shadow chuckles. The candle, predictably, goes out. Chapter 6. The Abbot's Midnight Tea Party. The invitation appears on your pillow at dusk, written in a spidery hand on parchment that crumbles slightly at the edges. It smells faintly of mildew and bergamot. You are cordially invited to an evening of spiritual nourishment and light refreshment in the abbot's private chambers. Promptness is a virtue, RSVP not required, nor possible. You stare at it. The ink glistens wetly, as though freshly applied. You entertain the fleeting hope that this is a prank by one of the living monks, but no, the monastery hasn't housed living monks since the last outbreak of plague, when half the order died and the other half wisely fled. This is undoubtedly the work of the dead. At precisely midnight, not by your choice, the monastery's bell tower strikes 12 with eerie accuracy. Despite its lopsided construction, you find yourself standing outside the abbot's door. The wood is black with age, the iron handle shaped like a serpent swallowing its own tail. From within comes the sound of polite laughter and the delicate clink of china. The door creaks open before you can knock. Abbot Theodoric's ghost is exactly what one might expect of a man who spent his afterlife perfecting the art of hospitality. Impeccably dressed in robes that somehow remain spotless despite centuries of spectral wear, his tonsure gleaming as though freshly shaved, his smile the very picture of benign authority. The only hint of his true nature is the way the candlelight passes straight through his left ear. "Ah, our guest of honor," he booms, grasping your hand in a grip that feels like mist and static. "Come in, come in. Mind the step." Brother Aldrich insists on keeping it uneven for aesthetic reasons. The room is both larger and more crowded than it should be. Ghostly monks in varying states of decay sit perched on chairs that shouldn't physically fit in the space, sipping from cups that leave no stains when set down on the non-existent table. The air smells of phantom tea and very real decay. "Allow me to introduce you," the abbot says, steering you toward the assembled spirits. "Brother Marcus, our resident herbalist. Yes, still bitter about the hemlock incident?" "Oh dear, Gerald, not the boils again." The monk in question looks up from adjusting his spectral hood to better cover the weeping sores on his face. "They flare up when I'm stressed," he mutters. The abbot pats his shoulder. his hand passing briefly through rotting flesh. "We've all had a touch of plague, haven't we? Now, where are my manners? Tea." He presses a cup into your hands. "It's warm." This is somehow more disturbing than if it had been cold. You glance around the room. The other guests are engaged in what appears to be a heated debate about 14th century tax reforms. Brother Marcus leans toward you conspiratorially. "Whatever you do, don't mention the biscuit shortage of 1372, he whispers. "We lost 3 good men to that argument." The abbot claps his hands. "Now then, let's have some civilized conversation. Who would like to discuss the symptoms of bubonic plague?" A groan ripples through the assembly. "We did that last Tuesday," mutters Brother Gerald. "Very well, very well." The abbot sighs. "Perhaps our guest would care to share news of the outside world. How fares the church these days? Still hopelessly corrupt, I assume." You open your mouth to respond, but are interrupted by the sudden appearance of a spectral tray bearing what can only be described as the idea of biscuits. They have no substance, no weight, but when you experimentally mimic taking a bite, the ghost of flavor, something between dust and nostalgia, fills your mouth. "Delightful, aren't they?" the abbot says brightly. "Sister Agatha's recipe. She's not with us anymore. Well, not what with us, you understand. But her shortbread lives on in our memories. Quite literally." The conversation turns, as it inevitably does, to the many plagues the monks have endured. Brother Gerald perks up considerably, offering detailed descriptions of various rashes and swellings. Brother Marcus counters with an exhaustive list of ineffective herbal remedies. The abbot nods along, occasionally interjecting with comments like, "Yes, the old rub-it with leeches approach. Never did work, but marvelous for character building." Hours pass, or perhaps minutes. Time behaves strangely at ghostly tea parties. At some point you realize with dawning horror that you're enjoying yourself. The abbot's stories of medieval church politics are oddly gripping, and there's something perversely comforting about the way the monks argue over whose turn it is to haunt the wine cellar. Just as you're debating whether it would be rude to ask about the monastery's actual haunting schedule, the bell tower chimes once, a single, sour note that hangs in the air like a bad smell. The room falls silent. The abbot's smile doesn't waver, but his edges grow faint. It seems our time is up. How unfortunate. The monks begin to fade, one by one. Brother Gerald vanishes mid-sentence, his complaints about 12th century sanitation cut short. Brother Marcus gives you a wink and tips an imaginary hat before dissolving into the wallpaper. The abbot is the last to go. He lingers in the doorway, his form growing translucent as the candles gutter out. "Do consider joining us again," he says, as the last of the tea set winks out of existence. "Next week we're discussing the Spanish Inquisition. No one ever expects that one. And then you're alone in a dark, empty room that smells faintly of phantom Earl Grey and centuries-old regret. Sleep, when you finally stumble back to your cell, is a long time coming. You dream of endless tea parties where the cups are always empty and the conversation always circles back to the Black Death. Somewhere in the monastery, a ghostly kettle begins to whistle. You pull the pillow over your head and pretend not to hear it. Chapter 7. The Relic That Won't Relinquish You. The first time it happens, you mistake it for a trick of the wind. A brief, bony pressure against your shoulder as you examine the monastery's crumbling reliquary. The second time, there's no mistaking it. The tap is deliberate, precise, and accompanied by the unmistakable scent of frankincense and old parchment. You turn slowly. The finger bone hovers at eye level, suspended in midair with the quiet confidence of an object that has done this many times before. It is yellowed with age, the knuckle slightly enlarged, a scholar's joint perhaps, worn from years of gripping quills or wagging in correction. A thin silver chain dangles from one end, though there is no visible means of support. You blink. The bone does not disappear. If anything, it seems to lean forward slightly, as though examining you in return. According to the monastery's records, scribbled in the margin of a waterlogged ledger by a monk with atrocious penmanship, this particular relic once belonged to Saint Cuthbert the Unyielding, a 6th century hermit famed for his tenacity. When bandits raided his hermitage, he followed them for 3 days, politely but insistently requesting the return of his favorite cooking pot. When the local bishop attempted to reassign him to a different parish, he took up residence on the man's doorstep and refused to move until the decision was reversed. Death, it seems, has done nothing to soften his resolve. The bone taps your shoulder again. You consider running. This is inadvisable for 2 reasons. First, the monastery's corridors have a habit of rearranging themselves when unobserved. And second, the reliquary's ledger also contains several accounts of previous visitors attempting to flee, all ending with the same phrase, "I returned to us in time." The bone drifts closer. Up close, you can see tiny etchings along its surface. Minute, painstakingly carved prayers, in a language dead long before the monastery's foundation. It radiates a sort of patient expectation, like a librarian waiting for an overdue book. You clear your throat. "Can I help you?" The bone bobs in what might be a nod. Then it turns, though eternity is not quite the right word for how a single digit reorients itself, and floats toward the corridor. It pauses just beyond the threshold, hovering in a patch of suspiciously stable candlelight. Waiting gijai, leating gaudetiti. Against your better judgment you follow. The bone leads you on a winding path through the monastery, gliding effortlessly past Brother Aldrich's latest architectural adjustments, and straight through a wall where the haunted chamber pot's outraged sputtering can faintly be heard. It stops before a narrow door barely taller than your waist, a door you could swear wasn't there yesterday. With another tap to your kneecap, a disconcerting sensation, the bone gestures toward the handle. The room beyond is small, windowless, and smells overpoweringly of beeswax and gilt. A single writing desk dominates the space, its surface buried beneath layers of dust, and what appears to be a very old game of solitaire, played with prayer cards. The bone drifts to the desk and hovers meaningfully over an ink-stained blotter. You peer at the markings. "You want me to write something?" The bone executes a slow approving loop-the-loop. The ledger's accounts swim back to your memory. St. Cuthbert was also the patron of unanswered correspondence. It seems even death hasn't spared him from the curse of clerical paperwork. You sit. The bone nudges a quill toward your hand. The moment your fingers close around it, the whispers begin. Not the shadow's grocery lists or the choir's off-key muttering, but something far older. The voice is dry, paper-thin, and implacable. To His Eminence, Bishop Aldrich of Whitby, it dictates. Regarding the matter of the missing sheep, which I maintain were taken by wolves, and not, as has been baselessly suggested, converted to monastic use. You write. The words flow faster than your hand can follow, the quill scratching furiously as the saint's centuries-old grievances spill onto the page. Complaint after complaint unfolds. Unpaid tithes, disputed land boundaries, a shocking allegation about the bishop's nephew, and a cask of sacramental wine, each more elaborately worded than the last. The bone hovers approvingly, occasionally nudging your wrist to emphasize a particularly important point. Hours slip by unnoticed. Your fingers cramp. The candle never burns down. At last, the dictation ceases. The bone bobs once satisfied and taps the final line. Yours in righteous exasperation, Cuthbert the Unyielding. You sign. The moment the quill leaves the parchment, the letter vanishes in a puff of dust. The bone, however, remains. It drifts to your shoulder and settles there, light as a dried leaf. When you reach to brush it off, It dodges your fingers with the ease of long practice. The caretaker finds you at dawn, slumped over the desk with ink-stained hands, and the vague sensation of having been thoroughly used. He takes one look at the bone, now perched atop your head like a macabre crown, and sighs. Ah, you met the finger. He shakes his head. Don't worry, it'll lose interest in a week or two, maybe a month. The record's 9 years, but Brother Anselm was a terrible correspondent. The bone taps your forehead, as if to say, you don't listen to him. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and haunted by the sound of a quill scratching endlessly in the dark. Somewhere in the monastery, a very satisfied saint waits for his reply. And on your pillow, just visible in the pre-dawn gloom, a single yellowed finger bone rests, patient, persistent, Chapter 8. The Bed That Rocks Itself. The cradle bed was not meant for grown men. This was evident from the moment you first laid eyes upon it. An ancient, oversized crib carved from blackened oak, its sides polished smooth by generations of tiny, restless hands. The caretaker had called it the Prior's penance, though he'd refused to elaborate beyond a cryptic mutter about ungrateful infants and their unfinished lullabies. You should have asked for clarification. The first night passes without incident. The bed remains still, its curved runners planted firmly on the uneven stone floor. You begin to suspect the caretaker's warnings were exaggerated, until exactly 2:17 a.m., when the entire structure lurches sideways with the violence of a ship caught in a squall. You are thrown against the slatted rails, knees wedged awkwardly against your chin. The bed rocks again, harder this time, its motion neither gentle nor rhythmic but sharp and insistent, like an impatient nanny jostling a colicky babe. The wood groans. The joints creak. Somewhere beneath you, a voice, high-pitched and petulant, begins to wail. Shh, hisses another, directly in your ear. You'll wake the others. There is no one else in the room. The rocking stops as abruptly as it began. The silence that follows is thick with unspent energy. You lie perfectly still, muscles tensed, waiting. A breeze you know isn't real stirs the air above your face. Something cold and weightless brushes your forehead, the ghost of a kiss perhaps, or the memory of one. Then the whispering starts. She never finished the song, murmurs the voice. It is neither old nor young, but somehow both at once, frayed at the edges like a well-worn shawl. Third verse, just when it was getting good. The bed gives an experimental twitch. You consider fleeing. This proves impossible. The moment you try to sit up, the cradle bucks violently, slamming you back onto the thin straw mattress. The voice tisks disapprovingly. None of that, it says. You'll upset the rhythm. There is no rhythm. There is only the bed's erratic juddering, the occasional stomach-lurching swing, and the growing certainty that you are caught in some long-dead nursery drama. By the third night, you develop a theory. The cradle moves most often at the precise moment you begin to drift off. Not enough to keep you fully awake, but sufficient to ensure you never progress beyond the edge of sleep. It is, you realize with dawning horror, the spectral equivalent of a child demanding just one more story. On the fourth night, you attempt negotiation. What song? You ask the darkness. The cradle stills. The air grows thick with sudden attention. Which song wasn't finished? You press. For a long moment, nothing happens. Then, so softly you almost miss it, the humming begins. It's a lullaby, or the ghost of one, simple and repetitive, the melody worn smooth by centuries of repetition. The voice falters at the end of the second verse, trailing off into silence. The bed rocks once gently. A question. You have no musical talent. This does not matter. The cradle creaks expectantly. With great reluctance you attempt to hum the next few notes. The effect is instantaneous. The bed bucks like a startled horse, nearly launching you over the rails. The voice shrieks, not in pain, but in outrage. Wrong, it wails. All wrong, she never went sharp on the ascending. Another violent rock, and the cadence was all a lurch sideways, backward. You cling to the rails as the cradle convulses, caught in the throes of a supernatural tantrum. The wood groans in protest. The straw mattress slides dangerously toward one edge. Then, as suddenly as it began, the storm passes. The cradle settles. The voice sniffles. "You're worse than the last one," it mutters. At least he could carry a tune. You do not sleep that night, nor the next. By week's end, you develop the hollow-eyed stare of new parents everywhere, jumping at every creak, braced for the next outburst. The finger bone, still perched on your shoulder, taps occasionally in what might be sympathy or amusement. It's hard to tell with saints. The caretaker finds you one morning, slumped against the refectory table, a cold cup of what might once have been tea clutched in your shaking hands. He takes one look at your twitching eye and nods. "Ah, the cradle's got you, has it?" He scratches his chin. "Brother Timothy lasted 3 months before he started sleepwalking into the river," said the water was quieter. "You make a noise that is not quite a whimper." The caretaker sighs. "Tell you what, I've got an old lute in the storeroom. Might be worth a try." That evening you sit cross-legged beside the cradle, lute in lap, and pluck out the mangled remains of the lullaby. The notes are wrong. The tempo is worse. The cradle rocks gently in time. Warmer, murmurs the voice. It sounds almost pleased. You play until your fingers bleed. The cradle never stops moving, but the motion changes, less violent now, almost soothing. The voice hums along, occasionally correcting your fingering with a sharp tug at your sleeve. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow and brief, punctuated by half-remembered melodies and the creak of wood on stone. The finger bone taps your cheek at dawn. You open your eyes to find the cradle still rocking steadily, though you've long since stopped playing. The voice is silent, but the air hums with something like contentment. As you stagger upright, the bed gives one final decisive rock, hard enough to send your lute tumbling to the floor with a discordant twang. The voice giggles. You decide to take your naps in the chapel from now on. The choir may be off-key, but at least they don't demand encores. Chapter 9. The Library of Unfinished Confessions. The monastery's scriptorium was not listed on any map, nor mentioned in any of the caretaker's warnings. You found it entirely by accident, or perhaps it found you, when a sudden draft blew your candle out and sent you stumbling through an archway you could have sworn hadn't been there moments before. The room smelled of vellum and frustration. Row upon row of writing desks stretched into the gloom, each occupied by the translucent figure of a monk bent over his work. Their quills scratched ceaselessly across parchment, filling the air with a sound like rats gnawing at the edges of sleep. None looked up as you entered. Their eyes, where they had eyes, remained fixed on their labor, their spectral fingers moving with desperate urgency. You approached the nearest scribe. His parchment was yellowed with age, its surface a chaos of crossed-out lines and ink blots. The words "she confessed to the sin of" were written at the top in a shaky hand, followed by 3 inches of carefully erased text. The monk's quill hovered over the page, trembling. "Excuse me," you whispered. The monk started violently, sending a splash of spectral ink across his robes. His face, when he turned it toward you, was a study in haunted exasperation. "What?" he snapped. "Can't you see I'm working?" You glanced at the mostly blank page. "On?" "A confession," he said, as though this were obvious. He gestured to the room at large. "We all are. Or we're trying to be." His voice dropped to a whisper. Brother Aldrich over there has been stuck on the same sentence since 1347. You followed his gaze to a particularly harried-looking ghost, whose parchment had more holes than parchment left from constant erasures. "What happens if you finish?" you asked. The monk shuddered. "No one knows. No one has finished. Not since—" He broke off as a loud gate-whacking echoed through the room. At the far end of the scriptorium, an ancient bell had materialized, its clapper swinging violently, though no hand touched it. The monks groaned as one. "Already?" muttered your new acquaintance. "But I'd nearly found the right adjective for gluttony." As you watched, the specters reluctantly pushed back their stools and began shuffling toward the bell. Their forms grew fainter with each step, until by the time they reached it, they had vanished entirely. The bell tolled once more, a sound that seemed to come from inside your skull, and then it too was gone. The scriptorium stood empty, the only evidence of its occupants, the half-written confessions left behind on every desk. You moved between the workstations, peering at the abandoned texts. Ye confessed to the sin of pride, specifically that time ye confessed to coveting Brother Thomas's turnips, which were undeniably, followed by 17 crossed-out descriptors. He confessed that I was the one who moved Abbot Gregory's favorite chair 3 inches to the left every morning for 40 years just to watch him. The conclusion lost. You a massive ink blot? The weight of centuries of unresolved guilt pressed down on you like a physical thing. You found yourself reaching for a quill that hadn't been there a moment before, its nib already dripping with ink the color of old bruises. Before you could stop yourself, your hand was moving across a fresh sheet of parchment. Qui confesse tu. The words hung there, unfinished. What didn't you have to confess? That you'd stolen a sweet roll from the monastery's kitchens? That you'd pretended not to hear the haunted chamber pot's latest hygiene lecture? That you'd secretly enjoyed the choir of the dam's rendition of Eades? The quill trembled in your grip. The blank space after the ellipsis seemed to grow larger, swallowing the page. A cold breath stirred the hair at your nape. Having trouble finding the right words? You turned to find the caretaker standing behind you, his expression unreadable. You looked down at your half-started confession. "I don't know what to write." He nodded sagely. "That's why they're still here, always searching for the perfect phrasing, the exact right word to sum up a lifetime of small sins." He gestured to the empty room. "The weight's not in the sin, you see. It's in the spokenness of it." The quill in your hand dissolved into mist. The caretaker turned to leave, then paused at the archway. "Mind you don't stay too long," he said over his shoulder. "They'll be back at Vespers, and Brother Aldrich gets testy when he finds mortals at his desk." You followed him out, casting one last look at the abandoned confessions. As you crossed the threshold, you could have sworn you heard the faintest whisper of quills resuming their work. Sleep came fitfully that night, your dreams filled with half-remembered sins and sentences that trailed off just before their meaning became clear. Somewhere in the monastery, a bell tolled for no one. And in a room that may or may not have existed, 17 quills scratched desperately at parchment, searching for the perfect words to end confessions that would never be finished. Chapter 10. The Courtyard of Echoing Footsteps, but no feet. The monastery's courtyard should have been peaceful. It was, by all appearances, a perfectly ordinary square of weathered flagstones surrounded by high stone walls, open to the sky and the occasional indifferent crow. But as with everything else in this place, appearances were not to be trusted. The footsteps began the moment you set foot across the threshold. Not your own, those made the wet, sucking noise of damp leather on stone, but another set entirely. Crisp, deliberate, and out of sync with yours, as though someone invisible had taken it upon themselves to pace alongside you. You stopped. The footsteps continued for 3 more strides before halting as well, the pause just slightly too long to be natural. The caretaker had mentioned this phenomenon in passing, though his explanation had been less than illuminating. Could be Brother Anselm, he said, scratching his beard. Or the wind, or the stones remembering. Hard to say, really. You took another step. The unseen walker matched you. Then, with sudden enthusiasm, it launched into what could only be described as a jaunt. The crisp a-tap-tap-tap-tap-ea of spectral souls circled you once, twice, then veered off toward the far wall, where it began a frantic back and forth that suggested either deep contemplation or an invisible dog searching for the perfect place to relieve itself. The acoustics theory seemed increasingly unlikely. You followed the sound, your own footsteps muffled by comparison. The pacing stopped when you reached the center of the courtyard, replaced by an expectant silence. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and damp wool. Then from directly behind you came a sharp yahem, the universal sound of a ghost who believes it has been slighted. You turned. The courtyard was empty. The sigh that followed was so heavy with exasperation that you could almost picture its owner, some long-dead monk, forever doomed to be ignored by the living. For a moment you considered speaking aloud, but what did one say to a pair of disembodied footsteps? Lovely weather for haunting? Pardon me, but have you seen your feet? Before you could decide, the footsteps took off again, this time with purpose. They led you to the eastern wall, where a patch of particularly worn stones formed what might have been a path, had anyone visible been walking it. Here, the pacing became rhythmic, methodical, the tread of someone who had walked this exact route thousands of times before. You crouched, running a hand over the stones. The grooves were too even to be natural weathering. Centuries of repetition had left their mark, as surely as if the walker had been flesh and blood. A breeze stirred the air, carrying with it a whisper of sound, not words exactly, but the lee-shappy of them, the cadence of a complaint half-remembered. You caught the edge of something that might have been always the same, day after day, before it dissolved into the clatter of a loose stone skittering across the courtyard. The footsteps halted. The air grew thick with the sense of being watched by something that had no eyes. You cleared your throat. Lung shift? The response was immediate. A gust of wind that may have been laughter, followed by a renewed burst of pacing, this time in a wide, energetic circle around you. The steps were lighter now, almost playful. Then, abruptly, they stopped. A single deliberate ekatapi sounded just inches from your left foot. Then another, closer. Then another, until it became clear the unseen walker was towing an invisible line, edging nearer with each step. You held your ground. The footsteps crept closer, paused, then, with the air of a creature testing a theory, stepped directly onto your own foot. There was no pressure, no chill, just the faintest impression of something noticing you, the way one might notice an unexpected stone in one's boot. The courtyard held its breath. Then, with a sound like a shrug, the footsteps marched straight through you and off toward the far wall, where they resumed their endless pacing as though nothing had happened. You stood there for a long moment, caught between awe and absurdity. Somewhere above, a crow cackled. The caretaker found you there an hour later, still watching the empty courtyard as the footsteps wove their ceaseless path. "Ah," he said, nodding at the air where the steps were loudest. "You've met the walker. Is it always like this?" you asked. The caretaker scratched his chin. "Most days. Sometimes it tries to sneak up on the kitchen cat. Once it got into an argument with Brother Aldrich's ghost about who had right-of-way near the refectory." He shrugged. "Never stops moving, though. Not in 400 years. As if to prove his point, the footsteps suddenly broke into a run, circling the courtyard twice before skidding to a halt, just behind the caretaker. A pause. Then a single, pointed igstompy. The caretaker sighed. Yes, very impressive." The footsteps huffed, an impressive feat for something without lungs, and resumed their pacing. That night, as you lay in your cell, the sound followed you into dreams. The endless, patient tread of someone who had all the time in the world and nowhere left to go. Somewhere in the dark, The courtyard stones remembered. And the walker walked on. Chapter 11. The Well of Whispers. The monastery's well had the look of something that had been judging people for centuries, and found them perpetually wanting. Its stones were worn smooth by generations of hands, some seeking water, others perhaps answers, and its opening gaped like a mouth perpetually on the verge of delivering bad news. A frayed rope dangled into the darkness, swaying slightly even when there was no wind to move it. You leaned over the edge, peering into the black. The caretaker had warned you not to do this, which of course meant you had to. "Hello?" you called, your voice disappearing into the depths. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then from somewhere far below came a sound like wet stones grinding together. "Whoa, wonderful," sighed a voice that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Another one." The words echoed oddly, as though they'd been chewed before being spat upward. You jerked back, but not before catching the unmistakable tone of celestial disappointment. "Another what?" you asked. "Another mortal sticking their nose where it doesn't belong," the well replied. "Do you have any idea how many of you I've seen come and go?" "No, of course you don't. They never do." The rope gave a petulant twitch. "Hunt, what exactly were you hoping to accomplish? A bit of wisdom." A cryptic prophecy? Or were you just bored? You hadn't considered this. "I thought there might be water." "Oh, there's water," the well said darkly. "Plenty of water. And bones. And one very rusty bucket that Brother Hilary dropped in 1423. But you didn't come here for water, did you?" A chill draft rose from the depths, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. The rope swayed more insistently now, as if urging you to take hold of it. "I go on a still be." Well coaxed. "Make a wish. That's what they all do eventually. Just be warned, I specialize in ironic fulfillment." You hesitated. "What does that mean?" "Oh, you know," the well said airily. "How you will. Wish for wealth, get a chest full of plague-ridden coins. Wish for love, find yourself haunted by the ghost of someone's overly affectionate grandmother. That sort of thing." The rope gave a suggestive jerk. "But I'm sure you'll be different." The skepticism in its voice was thick enough to chip off and sell as mortar. You eyed the darkness warily. "Have you ever just given someone what they asked for?" The well made a sound like water draining from a tub. "Once, a child in 1562 wished for her mother to stop coughing. Very sweet, very specific, ruined my reputation for months." The rope twitched again. "But you're not a child, are you?" You were saved from answering by the sudden appearance of the caretaker, who ambled into the courtyard with the air of a man who had been expecting to find you here. "Ah," he said, nodding at the well. "Getting life advice from our resident pessimist, are we?" "A realist," corrected the well. The caretaker ignored this. "Brother Aldrich designed the well, you know. Said symmetry was overrated. Dug it crooked just to spite the abbot." He patted the uneven stones fondly. "Been cranky ever since." "See, I'm not cranky," the well protested. "I'm selectively helpful. You told the bishop's nephew he'd die alone, surrounded by cats." Hunt? "He did." "Exactly," the well said smugly. Its voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper aimed at you. "Kaya, as I wished for hair. Got a lovely wig made from actual horsehair. The horse was still using it at the time." The caretaker sighed. "Come away before it starts offering you investment tips. Last traveler who listened ended up buying shares in a haunted salt mine." As you turned to leave, the well called after you. "She'll be back. They always come back, usually around midnight when the wine runs out and the regrets set in." Its laughter followed you all the way to the cloisters, a sound like stones tumbling down a hill. That night, As you lay in bed, the wind carried whispers up from the courtyard. Fragments of conversation not meant for living ears. Waste of good rope. Never even said thank you. Fee, and probably would have dropped the bucket anyway. Sleep, when it came, was filled with dreams of endless falling, punctuated by a voice from the darkness offering increasingly terrible life choices. Morning found you parched but determined. You'd fetch your own water, thank you very much. Somewhere in the courtyard, a frayed rope swayed in a non-existent breeze, waiting. Chapter 12. The Night Watchman Who Doesn't Watch. Brother Arnulf had been asleep for nearly 600 years, and he showed no signs of stopping any time soon. You found him at his post in the gatehouse, slumped over a crumbling ledger, his quill still clutched in ghostly fingers as though he'd simply dozed off mid-sentence. The candle beside him burned with a steady, unnatural flame, the same flame that had been burning, you suspected, since the night he first nodded off in 1423 and never quite woke up again. His snoring was a rhythmic, almost comforting sound, like a saw working its way through particularly soft timber. Every so often it would hitch, as though he were on the verge of waking before settling back into its steady rumble. You cleared your throat. Brother Arnulf snorted, smacked his lips, and buried his face deeper into the crook of his arm. "Excuse me," you said. One translucent eyelid fluttered open, revealing a bleary eye the color of weak tea. It fixed on you with an expression of profound betrayal before sliding shut again. "You neuf Brother Arnulf," said it, which might have been a greeting or a request for silence. The caretaker had warned you about this. "Don't bother trying to wake him," he'd said. Brother Arnulf takes his rest very seriously. Got himself assigned to night watch specifically so he could sleep through it. And death hasn't changed his habits one whit. You leaned closer, examining the ledger. The last entry read, "Oikard watch. All quiet except for..." The sentence trailed off into an ink blot that suspiciously resembled a drool stain. A particularly loud snore startled you back. Brother Arnulf had shifted position, his head now pillowed on his arms, his expression one of beatific contentment. The candle flame flickered in time with his breathing. It was, you realized, an impressive display of commitment to the art of napping. While the other ghosts of the monastery went about their various hauntings with energy and enthusiasm, rearranging furniture, singing off-key, offering unsolicited advice, Brother Arnulf had perfected the far rarer skill of being profoundly, unshakably at rest. You envied him. The realization came with a pang of something like guilt. Here you were, another sleepless visitor in a long line of sleepless visitors, staring at a ghost who had achieved what you could not. Perfect, uninterrupted slumber. And worse, he made it look easy. Brother Arnulf sighed in his sleep, the sound carrying a note of satisfaction that bordered on smugness. His candle flickered again, casting shadows that danced across his translucent form. For a moment you could have sworn you saw the ghost of a smile tug at his lips. It was infuriating. "Don't you have duties?" you muttered. One eye cracked open. Nein. Watching the eye closed. How very important. Another snore. You glanced around the gatehouse. The door stood unbarred. The watchtower stairs were thick with cobwebs. The horn meant to signal danger had a family of mice nesting in it. Brother Arnulf's ghostly chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Somewhere in the monastery, a chair scraped across stone. Brother Aldrich redecorating again. The choir of the damned began their nightly warm-ups with a discordant wail. From the direction of the latrines came the unmistakable sound of the haunted chamber pot, lecturing someone about proper hand-washing technique. Brother Arnulf slept through it all. You watched him for a long time, torn between admiration and resentment. Here at last was a ghost who had mastered the one thing that eluded you in this restless place. Peace. The candle burned lower. Outside, the moon climbed higher. Eventually, you found yourself yawning. Brother Arnulf chose that moment to let out a particularly contented sigh. It was, you realized, the sigh of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone, not even to death itself. You left him there, still sleeping, still at his post, still utterly failing to watch anything at all. That night, for the first time since arriving at the monastery, you slept soundly. Somewhere in your dreams you heard a familiar snore, soft, satisfied, and just a little bit smug. When you woke at dawn, well-rested and confused, you half expected to find Brother Arnulf's ledger open to a fresh page with a new entry. Behind his watch, all quiet, especially me. But of course it wasn't. The inkblot remained, the candle still burned, and Brother Arnulf slept on, eternally, unrepentantly, and with what you could now recognize as hard-won expertise. The caretaker found you staring at the sleeping ghost later that morning. "Ah," he said, "you've met our resident expert." You nodded. "He's good at what he does." The caretaker chuckled. "The best. Been asleep through 3 invasions, 7 plagues, and that time the choir tried to perform an entire requiem in one breath." He patted the gatehouse wall fondly. "Some say he's the only sane one left in the place." Brother Arnulf chose that moment to let out a particularly loud snore. You couldn't argue with that. Chapter 13. The Feast of the Famished Friars. The invitation arrived in the same manner as all the monastery's spectral correspondence, materializing suddenly in your pocket when you weren't looking, the parchment slightly damp and smelling of centuries-old cellars. "You are cordially invited to attend the monthly mortification banquet," it read in spidery script. "I fearing imaginary delicacies, spiritual sustenance, and Brother Gerard's famous complaint about the venison portions. Formal robes optional, but judgment inevitable." The refectory was already crowded when you arrived, the long tables lined with translucent monks in various states of decay and discontent. Platters piled high with food that wasn't there dotted the tables, and the air thrummed with the sound of silverware clinking against plates that bore no scratches. "Ah, our guest of honor." Abbot Theodoric's ghost boomed, waving you toward the only empty seat, directly between Brother Marcus, still picking spectral herbs from his teeth, and Brother Gerald, whose boils pulsed alarmingly whenever he got excited. "Come, come, the first course is about to be served, metaphorically speaking, of course." As you sat, a tureen of what appeared to be soup appeared before you. Or rather, the idea of soup appeared. A shimmer in the air where soup might have been, had any of this been real. Brother Hilary, seated across from you, made an elaborate show of sniffing appreciatively. Excellent vintage this year. Notes of desperation with just a hint of turnip." You watched as the monks all raised their spoons in unison and made careful motions toward their mouths. Some even went so far as to dab at their lips with napkins that didn't exist. "It's a bit thin," muttered Brother Gerald, swirling his spoon through empty air. "Nonsense," Brother Marcus retorted. "The texture is perfect for a broth of this spiritual significance. You've always had the palate of a common bandit." Brother Gerald's boils darkened. "At least bandits got real food." The argument might have continued had the next course not arrived, a haunch of spectral venison that sent the monks into raptures. "Finally," Brother Gerard cried, gesturing to his plate. "Though I must say the portions have gotten smaller every century." You blinked. There was literally nothing on his plate. Abbot Theodoric sighed. "Brother Gerard, we've been over this. It's not about the quantity. It's about the principle." Gerard snapped, sawing vigorously at his invisible meal. "A man, living or dead, has certain expectations at a banquet." Around the table, murmurs of agreement rose like steam from a phantom stew. You experimentally mimed cutting into your own non-existent venison. The monk to your left, Brother Anselm of the famously flat singing voice, nodded approvingly. Good form, he said around a mouthful of nothing. Elbow in. You'd think mortals would have forgotten proper dining etiquette by now. But here you are, proving me wrong. The meal progressed through several more imaginary courses, each met with increasing commentary. The bread was too stale, despite not existing. The wine was too sour, despite being entirely conceptual. And the cheese, oh, the cheese, was apparently an insult to dairy craftsmen everywhere. By the time dessert arrived, a shimmer in the air that might have been custard, the complaints had reached a fever pitch. I remember when these feasts used to mean something, Brother Hilary said mournfully, pushing around spectral crumbs with his spectral fork. Back in 1342 we had 7 full courses of imaginary delights. 7, and the spiritual symbolism was Glairdy. Abbot Theodoric patted his hand. Now, we must make do with what we have. Which is nothing, Brother Gerald muttered. Literally nothing. You were beginning to understand why these banquets were called mortification feasts. As the meal wound down, the monks leaned back in their chairs, which creaked properly despite being only half there, and engaged in that time-honored tradition of critiquing everything they just pretended to eat. Brother Marcus turned to you suddenly. And what did you think of the meal, eh? All eyes, and several empty sockets, fixed on you. The venison was very present. You tried. A hush fell over the table. Then, to your horror, the monks burst into applause. Marvelous critique. Brother Anselm cried. Present. Oh, that's good. I'm using that next time. Present, Brother Gerard repeated, nodding sagely. Exactly. Not absent like last month's mutton. Abbot Theodoric beamed at you like a proud father. You see? Our guest understands the subtle artistry of imaginary dining. As the monks drifted away from the table, still arguing about the quality of non-existent cheese, you found yourself oddly touched. They'd been pretending to eat imaginary food and complaining about it for centuries, and they showed no signs of stopping anytime soon. There was something almost comforting in the ritual of it, the way they kept up appearances long after appearances mattered, the way they clung to their petty grievances like lifelines. The caretaker found you still sitting at the empty table long after the last ghost had faded. How was the banquet? He asked, already knowing the answer. You looked down at your clean plate. The venison portions were too small. He nodded solemnly. They always are. That night, as you lay in bed, your stomach rumbled, not from hunger, but from the memory of a meal that never was. Somewhere in the monastery, the echoes of silverware on plates and the murmurs of discontented monks lingered like the scent of a feast long past. Sleep came easier than it had had in weeks, your dreams filled with imaginary courses and complaints that would never be resolved. And in the refectory the table stood ready, waiting for next month's banquet, when the famished friars would once again pretend to eat, pretend to drink, and very sincerely complain about every bite they didn't take. Chapter 14. The Bell That Rings for No One. The first time you heard the bell, it was 3:17 in the morning. The sound tore through the monastery like a physical thing, a single, shuddering note that vibrated in your teeth and sent the shadows scrambling for cover. By the time you reached the bell tower, still groggy and clutching a candle that had gone out 5 corridors back, the courtyard was empty. The great iron bell hung motionless in its crooked tower, not even swaying slightly, as though it had never moved at all. The caretaker found you there at dawn, staring up at the silent bell, with the expression of a man questioning his life choices. Ah, he said, scratching at his beard. You've met our welcoming committee. The bell rang, you said, because this seemed the most important fact. The caretaker nodded. It does that. But there's no one here to ring it. There doesn't need to be, the caretaker said, as though this explained anything at all. He squinted up at the bell. Some say it's Brother Timothy, the old bell ringer, still trying to keep to his schedule. Others think it's the bell itself, remembering when it had important things to say. He paused. Personally, I think it's just marking arrivals. Arrivals? The caretaker gave you a look that suggested he was being patient with you. New ghosts, of course. The monastery's been collecting them for centuries. They've got to announce themselves somehow. This did not explain why the bell chose to make these announcements at profoundly antisocial hours. The next time it rang, you were ready. The note had barely finished echoing before you were out of bed and sprinting barefoot through the corridors, determined to catch the culprit in the act. By the time you reached the bell tower, lungs burning, nightshirt snagged on something that had definitely not been there earlier, the clapper was already still. But the air smelled of lightning and wet stone, and the hairs on your arms stood straight up, as though charged with static. Then you heard it, the footsteps. Not the familiar pacing of the courtyard walker, but something new, a slow, measured tread descending the spiral stairs from the belfry. Step, put guard. Pause. Step, put e. Pause. As though whoever, whatever, was coming down was in no particular hurry. You held your breath. The footsteps reached the bottom step. Stopped. A cold draft curled around your ankles. The candle flame, which had against all odds remained lit during your mad dash, guttered violently, then nothing. The staircase was empty. The courtyard was empty. The bell, when you worked up the courage to check, was still warm to the touch. You spent the rest of that night in the chapel, where at least the choir of the damned's off-key muttering provided some company. The bell's third performance came a week later, at the deeply unreasonable hour of 4:03 a.m. This time, you didn't bother running. Whoever was ringing it clearly had no interest in being caught. Instead, you lay in bed and counted the seconds between tolls, noting how the echoes seemed to linger just a hair too long, as though the sound was reluctant to fade. In the morning, you found the caretaker oiling the gate hinges. "Did we get a new ghost last night?" you asked. He didn't look up from his work. "Depends on your definition of new." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you'll get," he said, and spat on the hinge for good measure. The mystery might have remained unsolved if not for Brother Arnulf. You found the perpetually sleeping watchman unusually alert one evening, his translucent form propped upright in his chair, his normally placid face creased with irritation. "Third night in a row," he grumbled when he saw you. "You'd think the newly dead would have more consideration for those of us trying to get some rest." You blinked. "The bell?" "Arrivals," he corrected. "Call hours. No regard for proper haunting schedules." He yawned enormously. "First it was the laundry ghost. Then the scullery maid. Now this one, pacing the cloisters all night, sighing dramatically. His eyelids fluttered. No respect for tradition." And with that, he was asleep again, his chin dropping to his chest with a soft white thump that shouldn't have been possible for a ghost. You found the newcomer in the herb garden, as promised. Or rather, you found the evidence of her, a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather, and the distinct impression that someone had just vacated the bench you were looking at. The bell, you noticed, was ever so slightly ajar. "Hello?" You tried. The rosemary bush shuddered, though there was no wind. A single sprig snapped off and floated upward, coming to rest behind an invisible ear. You sat on the bench. The wood was icy against your thighs. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so quietly you might have imagined it, "Guy never planted the lavender." The voice was thin and reedy, the sound of a hinge that hadn't been used in centuries. She told them, year after year. "Sister Marguerite," I said, "lavender keeps away the moths." Did they listen? A sigh like dry leaves. "I did not," said Annie. You glanced around the garden. There was indeed no lavender. "I'm sorry," you offered. "The vestments were ruined." The voice continued mournfully. "Absolutely crawling with moths. I told the abbot. This is what comes of ignoring good advice. A pause. He assigned me to latrine duty for a month. Atem den Fissen. Sister Marguerite and the monastery's long-dead seamstress, still bitter about herbaceous slights centuries later. The rosemary twitched again. Sure sitting on my thimble. You leapt up. The bench was empty, save for a small round depression in the wood that might have been anything. When you looked back, the rosemary sprig was floating mid-air, bobbing slightly as though its wearer had cocked an invisible head. You'll speak to the gardener about the lavender? You opened your mouth to explain that you were a temporary visitor with no horticultural authority whatsoever, but the hopeful tilt of that floating rosemary gave you pause. I'll mention it, you said. The rosemary sprig bobbed in what might have been a nod. Good eye. See that you do. Then the chill lifted, the rosemary fell to the ground, and you were alone in the garden with the distinct impression you'd just been recruited into a centuries-old feud. That night, the bell didn't ring at all. But just before dawn, as you teetered on the edge of sleep, you heard it, the faintest isnick of scissors cutting cloth and a voice murmuring, "Lavender. I'll have lavender this time, or so help me." Sleep, when it came, was filled with dreams of moths and tangled thread. And in the bell tower, the great iron bell hung silent and still, waiting for its next invisible guest. Chapter 15. The Cryptic Graffiti of Brother Anselm. The walls of the monastery's cloisters were a palimpsest of centuries' worth of monastic boredom. Scratched into the stones were crude sundials, endless tallies marking days until feast days, and a surprisingly accurate sketch of what appeared to be Bishop Ambrose with donkey ears. But one section near the refectory stood out, a patch of wall covered in meticulously carved cats, their tails looping into elaborate borders around words that had been worn smooth by time and curious fingers. You traced the largest inscription with your fingertip. Cave sternutationem, it read. Beware the sneeze. Brother Anselm's ghost found you there, his translucent form hovering just behind your shoulder, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been waiting years for an audience. "Ha ha ha," he said. "And my masterpiece." Up close you could see that what had initially appeared to be random doodles were in fact an elaborate system. Cats chasing birds that formed letters, cats curled into punctuation marks, cats whose tails spiraled into the margins only to reappear 3 feet to the left, batting at a word that had no business being there. "It's very feline," you said carefully. Brother Anselm beamed. "Perfect subject for contemplative art. Silent, capricious, cleanlier than most monks." He pointed a spectral finger at a particularly plump cat carved near the base. Cat, one was Brother Timothy's favorite, called it the Abbot's double. The caretaker ambled by, a bucket of suspiciously dark liquid in one hand. "Don't ask him about the sneeze," he muttered as he passed. "We'll be here all week." This, of course, guaranteed you would ask. Brother Anselm's ghost lit up like a stained glass window in morning light. The great sternutation, a tale of hubris, of vengeance, of... He paused dramatically. Calagis. As it turned out, Brother Anselm had been the monastery scribe until an unfortunate incident involving a newly arrived shipment of pepper, an overzealous novitiate, and what he described as a cascade of nasal misfortune. The resulting sneeze had sent an entire pot of ink arcing across the monastery's prized psalter, forever staining Psalm 23 with what looked disturbingly like a demonic goat. "They reassigned me to latrine duty," Brother Anselm said mournfully. Whose marginalia had been praised by 3 separate bishops. The injustice clearly still rankled, centuries later. You eyed the carvings with new understanding. The cats weren't just cats, they were revenge. A quiet, meticulous rebellion scratched into the very stones of the monastery that had wronged him. "He sneeze, it was merely the cat list," Brother Anselm continued, gesturing to another patch of carvings. Key real crime was their failure to appreciate visionary art. This section depicted what appeared to be a monk, identifiable by his tonsure, being set upon by a swarm of winged somethings. The inscription beneath read Cave Apis with an arrow pointing emphatically at the monk's swollen nose. Beware the bee, you guessed. His sister Agatha kept hives, Brother Anselm explained. Neva forgave me for the pepper incident. Said I'd frightened her bees. He sniffed. If bees have the capacity for higher reasoning. The more you looked, the more the walls revealed. A cat wearing a bishop's mitre. A mouse peeking out from a communion wafer. A surprisingly graphic depiction of someone being struck by lightning beneath the words K. Fullman, which the caretaker later informed you was less prophecy and more Brother Anselm's wish list. But the pièce de résistance was tucked into an alcove near the kitchen. A life-sized carving of a cat wearing monastic robes, its paw raised in blessing over a bowl of fish. The Latin inscription was weathered but legible. Sanctus Catus, ora pro nobis. Sancat, pray for us. Brother Anselm looked absurdly pleased with himself. Took me 14 years to finish that one. Carved it during night vigils. Abbot never noticed. The caretaker, passing by with a ladder, snorted. Abbot noticed. Just thought it was an improvement over your singing. Brother Anselm's ghost drew itself up indignantly. Me voice was a crime against harmony finished the haunted chamber pot from somewhere nearby. As the argument evolved, Brother Anselm insisting his choir solos had been ahead of their time. The chamber pot countering that they'd been an affront to decency. You examined the carvings more closely. There, nearly worn away, was one final message scratched into the base of St. Cat's pedestal. Cavi somnium belarsikiesitain, mundalmindai dipacted sikand. Beware the dream. You were still pondering this when the caretaker reappeared, this time armed with a broom. Don't think too hard about that one, he advised. Last visitor who did woke up with his beard braided and a dead fish in his boot. Brother Anselm's ghost, momentarily distracted from his musical defense, gave a suspiciously innocent cough. Cart is meant to provoke, he said primly. That night as you lay in bed, the moonlight cast strange shadows across your chamber wall. Shadows that, if you squinted just right, looked almost like a procession of cats dancing toward an invisible altar. Sleep, when it came, was restless and filled with the sound of distant sneezing. And somewhere in the cloisters, a newly carved cat watched the moon rise, its tail curled around two simple words. Gavlictorim Bunten. Beware the reader. Chapter 16. The Pillow That Sighs Back. The monastery's pillows had always been questionable at best. Lumpy sacks stuffed with what you hoped was straw. And not, as the caretaker had once joked, the hopes and dreams of disappointed novices. But yours was different. You noticed it the first night, when a particularly vigorous fluffing of the sad little cushion was met with a sound like a deflating bellows, a long, weary exhale that carried the weight of centuries of restless sleepers. You froze. The pillow lay innocently against the headboard, its frayed seams giving no hint of sentience. You poked it. Almost you? The voice was muffled, as though speaking through several layers of dusty fabric, and carried an accent that might have been Middle English, or possibly just very old and very tired. You considered your options. Screaming seemed excessive. Leaving the room would mean braving the corridor after dark, where the courtyard walker was no doubt pacing out his latest existential crisis. Instead, you did the only sensible thing. You whispered back. Did you just talking? The pillow gave a huffy little shift under your hand. And if I did? Is it so strange that a pillow might have thoughts? That it might grow weary of being pummeled by the restless heads of ungrateful mortals night after night, century after century? You stared down at it. Most pillows don't. Most pillows haven't been stuffed with the feathers of a griffin. The pillow sniffed. Not my fault. Some fool monk thought mythical creatures were fair game for bedding. Do you know how long it takes griffin feathers to stop being Yahweh? You did not, in fact, know this. The pillow settled into what you were coming to recognize as its lecture tone. 700 years, minimum, and that's if they're plucked ethically, which it gave a pointed cough. They were not. You lay back cautiously, half expecting a feather to jab you in protest. Instead, the pillow adjusted itself beneath your head with what felt like begrudging professionalism. Posture is all wrong, it muttered. No wonder you toss so much. Spine like a question mark. Over the next hour, you received what was possibly the most thorough critique of your sleeping habits ever delivered by an inanimate object. Your breathing was too shallow. Your shoulders were too tense. Your tendency to curl onto your left side was, according to the pillow, an insult to proper spinal alignment. At some point you must have dozed off because you woke to the distinct sensation of something flicking your ear. Snoring, the pillow announced. Dreadful habit, worse than Brother Arnulf, and he sounds like a drowning accordion. You groaned and dragged the blanket over your head. The blanket, you noted with alarm, was also unusually warm, and not in a comforting way. More in a I might also have opinions way. The caretaker found you at dawn, slumped over the refectory table with dark circles under your eyes, and a piece of straw stuck in your hair. Let me guess, he said, sliding a mug of something hot and suspiciously murky toward you. The griffin pillow. You made a noise that was not quite human. The caretaker nodded sympathetically. Sister Marguerite stuffed it back in 1242, swore the feathers would grant peaceful sleep. He took a sip from his own mug. Turns out, griffins hold grudges. You spent that day in a haze, jumping at every sighing breeze, every creak of furniture. Even the shadows seemed more judgmental than usual. That night you considered sleeping on the floor. The floor, you suspected, would at least have the decency to remain silent about your life choices. But the moment your head hovered uncertainly above the pillow, it let out a sound like a deflating souffle. Oh, just lay down properly. I won't say a word. It lied. But as the hours passed and the pillow's critiques gave way to grudging tips on proper neck support, you realized something strange. You were actually comfortable. More than that, you were sleeping. The pillow, sensing this, gave one final, satisfied "Niseston kanadferi vantlipnukikame." "It's told you so," it whispered just before you drifted off. In the morning, you found it plumped and waiting. It seemed suspiciously neat, as though it had spent the night repairing itself. A single griffin feather poked defiantly from one corner. You left it carefully centered on the bed, out of respect. Somewhere in the monastery, a very satisfied pillow settled in for its own well-earned rest. And in the courtyard below, the bell tolled, marking perhaps the arrival of a new ghost, or maybe just someone else who hadn't fluffed their pillow correctly. Chapter 17. The final verdict. Sleep is optional. The caretaker found you at dawn on your final morning, perched on the edge of the well, and engaged in what appeared to be a heated debate with the darkness below. I'm just saying, the well was arguing if you'd taken my advice about the salt mine investment. You told me it was haunted by prosperous spirits. And, wasn't it? It was a collapsed tunnel full of pickaxe-wielding ghosts. The well made a sound like a stone skipping across very smug water. Sounds prosperous to me. The caretaker cleared his throat. Leaving today, then. You turned, ready to unleash a month's worth of sleep-deprived grievances. The bell that rang for invisible guests. The choir that couldn't carry a tune if it had handles. The pillow that critiqued your REM cycles. But stopped when you saw the bundle in his hands. Thought you might want these, he said, offering a stack of neatly copied parchments. The monastery's unofficial records. All the bits the official histories left out. You flipped through the pages. Here was Brother Anselm's original sketch for St. Cat, complete with notes in the margins about which bishop most resembled a disgruntled owl. There were the minutes from the Famished Friars' infamous great mutton debate of 1412, complete with gravy stains. And, tucked between a complaint about laundry rotations and a recipe for ink that called for 3 drops of a novice's tears, you found it, a single yellowed page titled, Why Our Beds Are Terrible. Our beds are terrible. Definitive. List. The caretaker smiled, an expression that deepened the wrinkles around his eyes like well-worn parchment. Every visitor leaves something behind. You're leaving this. You looked down to where your own handwriting had somehow appeared on the last blank page, a careful accounting of all the ways the monastery had kept you awake, and all the ways you'd loved it anyway. Somewhere behind you, the bell tolled, not its usual midnight announcement, but something softer, almost fond. The courtyard walker's footsteps fell into step with yours as you made your way to the gate. The pillow, you noted with amusement, had somehow found its way into your pack. The caretaker swung the gate open. "Sleep well," he said, with the air of a man who knew you wouldn't. You stepped across the threshold into sunlight that felt suddenly too bright, too quiet. Behind you, the monastery stood as it had for centuries, crooked, crumbling, and utterly itself. That night, in an inn that was suspiciously free of hauntings, you lay awake staring at the ceiling. The silence was deafening. The bed was too still. The pillow beneath your head was, against all odds, disappointingly mute-dane. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled. Or perhaps it was just the innkeeper's cow. Either way, you smiled. Sleep, when it finally came, was deep and dreamless, and somehow, against all odds, you missed the chaos. The monastery would be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Its ghosts forever restless, its stories never quite finished, its beds eternally uncomfortable. And really, you thought as you drifted off at last, what more could anyone ask for? Somewhere in the dark a well chuckled, a pillow sighed, and a single stubborn candle flickered defiantly, just once, before going out.